This week, as DACA recipients, also known as Dreamers, give thanks for America, Congress is running out of time to keep them here. And from Denver, we learn about the refugee children who are flourishing in the classroom.
All of us, I think, felt that refugee resettlement, it's not a grim story or a dark story. It's a story of transformation and families being given a chance to start over and to flourish.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. Last June, at their annual meeting, 5,000 leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention explicitly voted to condemn the alt-right movement. It was an important decision at an important moment. Then, after the August ugliness of Charlottesville, I wondered how the Baptists would react. Over the last few weeks, 5 state Southern Baptist conventions approved resolutions decrying racism or white supremacy. In fact, the Alabama Baptist Convention's resolution went as far as saying they would oppose persecution and harassment of all racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, refugees, and anyone else targeted by white supremacist or nationalist groups. By and large, up to this point, these resolutions have gone unreported. On the other side of the Thanksgiving holiday, once tax reform legislation is resolved, look for attention to turn to the budget and a solution for Dreamers. And lots of pieces swirling around on this topic these days. Republican leadership is saying they want separate legislation for Dreamers in the new year, but a growing contingent of House Republicans are pushing for legislative action this year. For their part, Democrats are holding the line with their threats to shut down the government if a legislative solution for Dreamers is not part of the year-end budget. And Forward.us released a new report saying almost 300,000 DACA recipients, about 1,700 per business day, will be removed from the workforce between March 6th and November 6th of next year should Congress fail to find a solution. So, circle back to those Baptist resolutions I mentioned earlier. A question I get a lot these days is, what can I do? One answer I give is to call your member of Congress. Yes, it's an answer predicated on the notion that our political system is functioning at a high level. Yes, and it is a notion subject to considerable debate. But strangely, I'm not worried about our politics. Elections have consequences and they force varying versions of functionality. I'm actually more worried about our institutions, the organizations that help Americans grapple with the massive cultural changes we're going through. Our houses of worship, military, business associations, labor organizations, and schools. These are the places where people can do something our politicians can't. These are the organizations where we can relearn the arts, the science, the reason to find a common cause. Then, over time, our politics will get better. All of which is why I am thankful for those Southern Baptist resolutions, thankful for the people I work with, and thankful for you. Onward, I'm Ali Noorani. One more word about DACA, this time for one of its recipients. 20-year-old Maria Cervantes Garcia, a student from South Carolina. At our convening in Washington, D.C. last fall, she told us why she's proud to call herself an American.
I'm your neighbor. You've known me for so long. I don't tell you, hey, I'm illegal. I tell you, hey, I'm Maria. I go to school here. You talk to me, you eat with me. You probably even invited me to sleep over at your house. Just because you find out that I don't have a piece of paper that defines me as a legal student, it doesn't change who I am and the person that you've grown to know. And the person that you've grown to call your adopted daughter. Yeah.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Walmart Foundation, so retail sector employees can receive contextualized English language training through our project, Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce. And from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
At the Miami Book Fair, I met the award-winning author Helen Thorpe. Her latest book, The Newcomers: Finding Refuge, Friendship, and Hope in an American Classroom, follows the fortunes of 22 teenagers from around the world over the course of a school year in Denver. They arrived in Colorado from nations struggling with drought, famine, and war. Some are refugees, some had lost one or both parents. Helen followed the journeys of 3 families in particular, from Iraq, Burma, and the Congo.
Our main character is the teacher who's kind of heroically teaching 22 kids who speak 14 languages and use 5 alphabets, teaching them all English. But it's also very much a portrait of how these kids transform over the course of the school year. And they go from being really scared and silent and quiet and overwhelmed at the outset of the year to just being very rambunctious and fun and friendly and hilarious when they acquire enough English to be able to talk to one another at the end of the school year.
So let's talk about the students in a second, but I've also become increasingly interested in the role of teachers and principals and superintendents. So what was the teacher like?
Yeah.
What was the school like?
Right.
How was its, when you say it specialized in welcoming immigrants and refugees, what does that mean?
So South is a big urban high school in Denver. We have a South, a North, an East, and a West.
That's very creative.
Schools.
Yes.
Exactly. And South happens to be the place, in addition to being a neighborhood high school that serves lots of families who live close by, it's an upper middle class neighborhood. Simultaneously, it's also the place in the Denver public school system for kids who arrive speaking foreign languages other than Spanish, and for kids whose schooling has been interrupted. And if you put those two things together, a refugee kid often is arriving speaking a foreign language other than Spanish, and typically their school's been interrupted by war for a lengthy period of time. So to wind up in the newcomer room, a student should be speaking a foreign language and have been out of school for several years. So in the room, there were 4 kids from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 4 from Eritrea, 2 from Burma, 2 from Iraq. Let's see, there was a student from Vietnam, a student from Mexico, 2 from El Salvador. They were asylum seekers, those 2. They arrived without parents, no legal guardians, just at age 15 in both cases, traveling here on their own. And then there were other students from various additional countries, but the bulk of the room was from Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East.
And when we were talking earlier in the panel, we talked about how they started to relate to each other kind of across languages.
Yeah.
Describe a little bit kind of how these students from all corners of the world practically did begin to, not just relate to people who've been here who are native born, but just to each other.
So at the very outset, I actually was wondering, what have I done by choosing to put myself in this room? Like, can I really write a book about this? Because the teacher was going around the room just saying very basic things like, "Hi, my name is Mr. Williams. Nice to meet you." And the kids were saying absolutely nothing in response. And I remember calling my editor and saying, "I don't know if I can do this because the kids are just silent." And he just encouraged me to stay in the room and see what happened. And so very slowly, the kids would slide a piece of gum across a desk or, pull out a chair for one another. They were making little gestures saying, like, "I wish I could talk to you," or "I wish we could be friends, but, we can't really communicate yet." And eventually, over time, they were acquiring more English and figuring out how to use Google Translate to text one another in their home languages and translating that to the other kids' home language. But by the end of the year, they really had kind of transformed into these rambunctious teenagers worried about like acne medication or enjoying Converse high tops or scary movies and comparing which movies they thought were the scariest. There was a young guy from El Salvador who was quite the flirt, who was like singing Spanish language ballads to any young woman he thought was attractive. I think he proposed to one of the sisters from Iraq in math class and drew a wedding ring on her hand in blue ink, and things like this were, happening by the end of the school year. What I didn't know at the outset was that acquiring a second language is this huge intellectual feat, and what the brain does at the outset is goes into silent mode, and the first phase of language acquisition is actually known as the silent phase. So before you can produce foreign sounds in a new language, your brain will just listen very, very intently and puzzle over these strange, unfamiliar words, but it's actually absorbing lots of vocabulary and a lot of meaning before you can even articulate that. And then the next phase of language acquisition is called pre-production or early production. And in the early production phase, kids will be able to say words or phrases, but not yet full sentences. And then you get to intermediate fluency and advanced fluency and things like this. But the kids would learn at varying rates and in different ways. But by the middle of the school year and increasingly towards the end of the school year, their personalities were starting to blossom. So, there's this one young woman, Lisbeth, who's very, very exuberant and has 5,000 friends on Facebook and wants to speak to anybody, regardless whether they understand her native Spanish or not. She's going to chat with them. She starts teaching everybody in the room Spanish as she gets more comfortable in the classroom. And then there's Methuselah, who's very, very intent and very studious, and he wants to learn so much that he's coming over to me and putting down his homework in front of me and asking me to correct his sentences. And of course, Saul is the kid from El Salvador singing Spanish love songs to everyone. Jacqueline and Mariam are two sisters from Iraq, and they show up, one sister wearing a headscarf covering her hair, the other one not. And I'm wondering what that's all about. I start visiting their family at home and learn that their mom is Muslim, their dad was Christian, that he went missing in the course of the Iraq War, and that they've been sort of looking for a safe home ever since he cooperated with the U.S. military. They went to Syria and lived through the Syrian civil war unexpectedly after they moved to Damascus. Their neighborhood had a series of really horrific car bombings, and the girls witnessed a whole lot during that. And so basically they're double refugees and have been looking for a safe home for about a decade by the time they land in Denver. These kids arrive with these unbelievable stories, but what struck me the most was their thankfulness and their joy at feeling safe, how grateful they were to be here. They did not take this opportunity for granted. They wanted to work really hard to be successful here. They were all aware that they had left friends and family back in a refugee settlement maybe, or in the countries that they had moved here from. And so they understood how precious the opportunity was to settle in a safe home, and they were really determined to do their utmost and work really hard at school.
Did you see how they also began to interact with the broader student population? How did that change?
Yeah, so South has about 2/3 of the students are native born and about 1/3 are foreign born, and many of the kids have been in English language acquisition classes, but in the past. So there are kids throughout the building who are, say, in advanced placement classes now, fluent in English, but they're native Arabic speakers or Swahili speakers or Tigrinya speakers or you name it. So the teacher, Eddie Williams, was able to find a mentor for every student in the room. So he could see that his students were struggling to fit in and to make friends, and he went around and he found a mentor for every one of them. So Jacqueline and Mariam, the sisters from Iraq, he found a very high-achieving pair of twins, also from Iraq, in advanced placement classes to come have lunch with them in his classroom and kind of mentor them, explain the high school to them, make sure they were invited to parties and had friends. With the two boys from the Congo, Solomon and Methuselah, they are brothers who arrived speaking Swahili. He found a student in ROTC, also a Swahili speaker. That student was originally from Kenya, but they could communicate, and that student was able to explain the high school to them. The one student the teacher really struggled to find a mentor for was Shani from Tajikistan. He couldn't find a Tajik speaker, but Shani was fluent in Russian, and when he found a student who was Russian speaking, brought her to the classroom, Shani burst into Russian and began babbling away. She had so many questions and thoughts, and she talked so much, the other student was like, I think I need to come back tomorrow. So he found a mentor for everybody, and the students were just plainly so relieved to be able to talk in their home languages and get all this mysterious stuff like spicy chicken that the cafeteria was serving, or like how do you open up their locker. They had so many questions that they wanted to ask. It was a relief for them to be able to ask those questions in their home language.
And how was it getting to know their families?
Because I was invited to spend a year in their classroom and these kids had lived through so much, I really found that I had to think about how to be a good human being in that circumstance. I decided early on not to interview the kids or grill them about traumatic things during their school day. And when they told me that they'd lived through war anything traumatic. I just asked if I could come to their home and maybe meet their parents. Solomon and Methuselah from the Congo invited me home to meet their family, and Jacqueline and Mariam, who were from Iraq, also invited me to meet their mom and sister. And I spent a lot of time in those two households. The families were so warm and so welcoming. Generally, so if I was going to the Iraqi sister's home, their mom would make a feast of Middle Eastern food and invite me to come sit on their floor with them, which was the traditional way to eat in their culture. And I'd spend so many evenings with them. Just sometimes we would just watch Arabic language TV on YouTube, or the girls invented these like games to play with me. Like sometimes they would say the names of famous people in Iraq, and then they would just ask me to try and pronounce those names, and then they would laugh really hard at my lame pronunciation of these Iraqi names. I just thought it was a lot of fun to get to know them in all these different ways, over food or through television, or just playing around with them. I did invite their mom to tell me about the family's journey here, but we spent a lot of hours together just getting to know one another on a kind of a very human level. In that case, I'm a single mom with a teenager. This Iraqi mom is a single mom with 3 kids. I thought that for me, I could just empathize with her as a single mom. Her struggle exponentially harder than mine, but nonetheless, it's the struggle of being a single mom. Her predicament was she had lost her husband. In her case, due to war, he was most likely killed because he had cooperated with American forces. But here she was trying to raise teenagers by herself. She's the only income earner in her family. She doesn't have anybody with whom she can talk about, her struggles. She's the only adult in the home, and to me that's a familiar predicament. It's kind of my story writ large, if you will, but I just really empathized with her, and I think that comes across as I'm writing about her. When I was visiting the Congolese family, it was really interesting because my training as a journalist is I should find out the story, like why did they have to leave the Congo? What forced them to flee? How did they wind up here? And I just kept finding out that this family they would seem to answer my questions, but actually they were not really telling me why they left the Congo. And I didn't understand for a very long time that my questions were very American, or they were the kind of questions that a journalist would ask. But I was running into like a cultural prohibition. And in fact, in the Congo, there are these proverbs or sayings, like one is, you talk like a widow. And that's not a good thing. You're not supposed to talk like a widow. And that means that you're indulging in describing tragedy too much. So really, they had these prohibitions where they weren't really supposed to share difficult stories or talk about problems. The idea, for them to feel hospitable, if they were inviting me into their home, if I was coming and sharing a meal with them, they felt obliged only to talk about that which they could celebrate. So they really couldn't answer my questions. Mm-hmm. And eventually I sort of realized this, and I just decided to kind of honor their culture and do the kinds of things they wanted to do. So we started running errands together. Mm-hmm. Like they had bought a printer at Goodwill and it didn't have a power cord, and they didn't know where to find a power cord, and I took them to Radio Shack. Or they had junk mail and they didn't know, they got this one letter that seemed so important, and I was looking at this letter and I was like, well, this letter's from Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstakes, and I don't think you're going to win $1 million. Like, I know it seems important. You can put this letter in the trash. We were having those kinds of conversations, and in the end, I had the opportunity to travel to the Congo, and I actually went to the part of the Congo that this family was from, the eastern side of the Congo, near the city of Goma. They were from North Kivu. I traveled there with Air Force instructors from the Air Force Academy in Colorado, which is my home state, who were going there to try to understand demilitarization and the work that the United Nations was doing, trying to persuade militia members to put down their weapons and return to farming. That was a really instructive trip for me, and everything that the Congolese family didn't really want to discuss or talk about or burden me with, I was able to find out on my own independently. And I think that was the right thing to do, to let the Congolese family transition to America without asking them to rehash all this. But I certainly found it instructive to go and understand more about the militia groups troubling this side of the Congo, understand more about what ordinary families like theirs had lived through, why they had to flee. Their village was really overrun by different militia groups in that part of the Congo who were swooping down and raiding all the crops that they would spend, weeks growing. They would swoop down and steal their food, and they just couldn't even scratch out a subsistence farming existence safely there. And one uncle said to me, in a given morning you might step over 4 bodies. And then I began to understand what boys that I had gotten to know in their classroom, what they were leaving behind and what they were trying to put in the past. And it really made it very real for me, helped me understand why they had to leave.
What do you want to leave your reader with these stories?
These teenagers, when they were given the chance to live in a safe home and given a chance to thrive in a classroom with books and computers, which maybe they hadn't had before, they were able to learn so much. So the 2 boys from the Congo, Solomon and Methuselah, after 1 year in the United States, I watched them transition into mainstream classes the following year. They were reading Sherman Alexie's book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and then after that they were reading Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. So these kids can just do so much if given the opportunity. And honestly, for their teacher, for the social workers who worked with them, for the aid workers who worked with them, for me, it was frankly just a joy to watch these kids be given the chance to flourish and to thrive. And all of us, I think, felt that refugee resettlement, it's not a grim story or a dark story. It's a story of transformation and families being given a chance to start over and to flourish. So I think we all felt it was a story filled with joy and gratitude and transformation.
Thank you very much for the time. Thank you for not just writing the first 2 books, but thank you for writing The Newcomers. And where can people get it?
Well, they can buy it on Amazon or at their local independent bookstores, and I have links to all of that on my website at helenthorp.com. And it's really an honor to meet you. I've followed your work for years. I think what you're doing is incredible.
Thank you.
You're fighting the good fight and helping all of us get to know one another better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure.
There's more about Helen on our website, immigrationforum.org. And that's all for this week. I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America.